Hello, I'm Russell Rowland, and this is The Song of Roland, a podcast about American culture. I'm happy to welcome Alan Grostephan to the podcast. Welcome, Alan. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So Alan has just recently published a book called The Banana Wars that's just about to come out in paperback with Dzonk Books. And first, I wanted to ask you about your connection to Colombia. You lived there for a while, right? But are you a native of that country?
No, I'm not native to Colombia. I actually grew up in the Midwest. I was born in Minneapolis and so grew up around there. But I moved to Colombia in 2001 and lived there for a few years. And I've been back ever since. So I'm there all the time. I mean, at least every year it feels like for the summer, or for, weeks or months. And I've just made, really strong connections there. I lived in Bogotá, but and for those 3 years, I moved a little bit around the country. But once things sort of calmed down in other parts of the country, or it was safer to travel, as I went back, I started going to places like where the book is set, Urabá, which I guess I could have gone there when I lived there in the early 21st century, but it would have been tense. That would have been
Really?
a tense moment. Oh, yeah. Yep.
So what is it about that country that attracts you there?
It's hard to say in a way. I think when I went there initially, I had already lived in Latin America. I lived for a period in Chile, in Santiago, and loved the literary scene there. I loved all the poetry. And I think what drew me to Colombia was the war, and was also, I think, the involvement of the United States in the war. And so I was there doing some work as a journalist and writing about the coca fumigations and displacement. These were people from all over the country, right, who had been displaced often by violence, sometimes just by poverty. And it was, I don't know, I think what drew me sort of into that was just the culture of storytelling, everybody just talking. And some of the stories many of the stories I think were really hard to bear, and had or histories of trauma and violence, but were also fascinating, right? And we're being told with, I don't know, all this just sort of brilliant insight, and kind of the same I think goes for the research on this book. I went to Urabá and started talking to people, and immediately you sit down and just you hear stories that I think blow your mind, and that leads to writing. So
the perception of Colombia is that it's a pretty violent place. Most people know about the drug trade being such a dominant feature there, but what else about it is interesting and maybe people don't realize is happening in that country?
Yeah, I mean, everything really. I mean, there's such a small percentage of people involved in the drug trade, even though it's a lot of money, right? I mean, it's definitely, it's part of the business world. The laundering of money is in everything. And it's in the government in different ways. However, yeah, the people I know, my friends, most of my acquaintances, they've got just nothing to do with that, right? I mean, if you go to Apartado, where part of the book is set, like you see, kind of who's who in some ways. You can see who's involved in the drug trade. They're on motorcycles, or they're on, specific SUVs that are all tinted, and certain bars and restaurants and all that. And you hear stories about certain people and all that. But yeah, I think the thing that, people maybe don't know is just, it's a very warm, it's a very friendly, it's a very generous, very hospitable culture. Like, I felt like even in a big city like Bogotá, which is, known as a kind of a colder place in terms of the people, I would make friends every time I went out. I would go to the bookstore and make friends with people there. And so there's this kind of culture of, I remember hearing this word when I first moved to Bogotá, of tertulia, which is to sit around and talk about books and art and music. And so that, I just sort of love that you sit down for a coffee, or a drink and people don't think about the time, right? You just hang out and you tell stories and you listen to each other and then, like I was saying before, Bogota has been this capital for people from everywhere, all over the country. So you start to learn about, people from the plains and people from the Caribbean coast and people from the Pacific coast, just bringing, I think, all these different ways of thinking about being alive and working and surviving different hardships, right? So, you just hear a lot of great stories.
Colombia and South America in general has a rich literary history too, and it's kind of hard to talk about Colombian literature without mentioning Marquez. So, were you influenced by him and other writers from South America?
Yeah, for sure. I read a lot of just Latin American literature in general. So, but probably mostly South America and some from Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean. But I first read 100 Years of Solitude when I was a sophomore as an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Obviously, I loved it, right? It was a great novel. And then when I was working on the Banana Wars, I read it very differently, actually, because I've now been to his hometown and I know people from around there. I mean, I know a bunch of people from the Caribbean and from around Santa Marta and all that. So the book changes a little bit. It's much more funny, in fact. Right? You start to see all the humor that's just so, common. In terms of contemporary writers, the writer Pilar Quintana, who has been translated into English and I think won the National Book Award or was a finalist for it for her book La Perra, The Bitch. And then her subsequent novel, Los Abismos, The Abysses, was also fantastic. And then there's Tomás González, who is from Medellin, who's great. I've read a number of his novels. And also from Medellin is Héctor Abad Faciolince, who's written a great memoir about his father being murdered by paramilitaries in Medellin, and also has written a number of novels. And and then for this book, for the Banana Wars, I was reading all over the place, but I think around when I started the book, I went deeper into the writing of Roberto Bolaño. And I'd already read Chile by Night and Savage Detectives and Distant Star, and those were all great, but I read 2666, and I think that just that huge scope of that novel that goes all over the world, right? And has tons of characters. It's 1,000 pages long, so it's definitely, a bigger project than mine was. But it definitely is a book that makes you feel like you can do anything. And that you have that freedom to move around. And he's also, I think, very interested in violence and sort of the economic forces behind violence. Because at the center of that book, even though it starts with this French, Spanish, British, and Italian, this group of academics, right, obsessed with the German writer, it's all centered around women being killed in a fictitious Ciudad Juárez, right, Santa Teresita. And their bodies showing up dead all over the desert and on the streets of the city, and they're mostly factory workers or they're sex workers, so the whole book is sort of just kind of rotating around that violence and who's done it and the police and everybody involved in that and how that somehow affects these people's lives in Europe. So I think that for me was like very eye-opening that I wanted to write like that.
Well, talk about the germination of the Banana Wars. How did you come to focus on that? I assume this is based on real events. It feels like it is.
Yeah, it is. I mean, everything here is, there's all the characters are imagined and invented, but what is happening around them is historical, right? These are all things that happen, and so the book refers directly to certain events. And I think the historical framework of the novel is about this sort of from nothing building a banana industry in this specific place in Colombia in the late 70s, and just sort of consolidating all this land and creating this monoculture of bananas for export. And the people who did this, who came in and founded this industry, were mostly from Medellin, but there were Americans and Germans and people from all over the world buying up land and exporting bananas. And then in like the late 1980s, everything starts to explode, right? The workers organize into unions for better conditions, and the planters, rather than negotiate and give in a little bit, do the opposite, right? They start killing union leaders, and and they carry out certain massacres. And so the book actually begins referring to a couple massacres. Like one is in Punta Coquitos and Finca Honduras, and that's basically about this is in 1988 when these Medellin planters just essentially called in death squads who had lists of paper with names and went to banana camps and just pulled people out of their houses early in the morning and executed them.
Mm.
And so what happens there is then that of course strengthens the guerrillas, right? That the people resisting that kind of thing, or resisting the death squads, um, look for support and protection from the guerrillas. And so the guerrillas respond to that by killing banana managers, right? The
Mm.
owners themselves couldn't even visit their land at that time. They were all in Medellin, just sort of the same as my characters. They're doing business over the phone. And banana managers, anybody who's working in sort of an administrative capacity at a banana plantation was getting kidnapped or killed every day.
Mm.
And so it was going both ways in that way. Um, and then I think the other, in terms of the books, I think the book starts, at some point I realized I wanted to start there when things begin to fall apart, right?
Mm.
Because there was a period where banana workers made more money than people in other industries in Colombia.
Mm.
And from all over the Caribbean coast, people were showing up in Urabá to get these jobs and to build
Mm.
these banana plantations. So it was good money. They were tough living conditions, but the hope was that everybody's quality of life would get better, that they would build schools and there'd be hospitals. And so there was a minute where the guerrillas really couldn't even recruit, right? There's no reason to exist,
Mm.
right? But then as soon as there's repression and this level of exploitation, you've got this. There's a conflict, right?
Yeah.
I think sort of the impetus for the book was thinking more about the period in 1995 when the paramilitaries take control. So
Mm.
at that moment they control all the big towns. They control the ports. There's still a lot of violence going on. Guerrillas are still there in the early 90s for sure, but it's this sort of social cleansing occurs, and the banana planters, including Chiquita Banana and American banana producers, paid per box, right?
Mm.
Exported box, 3 cents a box of bananas, for these paramilitaries to be there, right? And according to the Chiquita, they had to pay. They didn't want to pay, but there
Mm.
was they were threatened by the paramilitaries, which I don't really buy. A lot of the paramilitary commanders talk about meeting with Chiquita Banana executives in Medellin and talking about what they were doing, right?
Mm.
And, essentially making the business safe to
Mm.
move bananas, right? But along with that is this huge cost of human life, right? I mean,
Right.
just this tremendous violence, where paramilitaries were, killing anybody that what they said who smelled like a gorilla, anyone who
Mm.
looked like a gorilla, anyone who was buddies or family members with a gorilla, anybody who voted a certain way, and at any sort of left wing or so-called communist ideology, right? I mean, suddenly all that was silenced, right? And
Mm.
everybody was living in a total state of paranoia and terror, looking over your shoulder, and yeah. So I
Yeah.
think that was what drew me in, is sort of how to get to that moment where Americans are involved in this because
Mm.
American companies are paying this tax and are also, I think, strategically involved in that. Paramilitaries also said that arms were brought into the banana canals, right?
Mm.
And using banana boats and banana barges, and those arms were coming from the United States.
Mm.
And so yeah, there's that connection. And I was interested in that, like trying to
Mm.
bring in these different worlds of an American banana executive who's one of the main characters in the book, along with the Colombian characters in the book.
Basically, it's just such a universal story about how the resources that a country has to offer can often become a source of great conflict, right?
Right, right.
Once it becomes a successful enterprise. So could you read these two sections that I pointed out earlier, and just to give us a little flavor of how the book opens and some of the things that you establish early on?
Sure. The fire was either fascinating or horrible, depending on who was looking at it. The thick black smoke rising from the fields, the cement walls painted with the acronyms of their groups. For some, the smoke tasted like progress, a better salary, and justice against the planters for killing workers and union leaders. For others, for some of those who worked on those same plantations, for the wives of the dead managers, for the pilots of the fumigation planes, it smelled like the end of everything. The tenuous order that held them together over the last couple years, it smelled like war. And then jumping ahead to the next paragraph you had asked about. The boom was exquisite. The guerrillas flinched and a couple ducked behind a tree, but kept their eyes open. The cab of the tractor trailer levitated for a moment over a spring of blue flames and smashed through the roof of the packing area. Orejas was mesmerized. It woke him up even more, and he knew the planters, safe in Medellin, would see it in photos, and know he was more trouble to them than la vacuna they should be paying, and the workers they should stop killing. It was payback for the massacres at Finconduras, La Negra, and Punta Coquitos. It was power in its purest light. You could burn down all the temples and cathedrals and all the scriptures and all the statues of saints, and even the equestrian statues of the liberators and conquerors who thought themselves gods but were just opportunists. You could burn the rich in their cars. You could drag Mario Zuluaga Espinel, the owner of Finca San Jorge, and rub his face in the ashes for the murder of 20 workers. You could sink the gringo ships over the water. You could dynamite the policemen trapped within their sandbag bunkers. While most towns in Colombia were built with a main plaza and a cathedral, a bell and a tower to be rung for mass, the towns in Urabá had no design, no sacred places. They were all ramshackle, one street dug into another, one neighborhood spilling out the backside of a banana field. Orejas believed they were meant to be burned.
Mhm. Good stuff. So one of the things I really liked about this novel is that you basically tell it in kind of an omniscient point of view, but you dip into a lot of the different characters, and some of them are well, they just cover a broad range of roles in this whole story, from the gringo in America who gets involved in this industry to the women. My two favorite characters were Nancy and Yulia.
Mm-hmm.
So, talk about what you were trying to accomplish with bringing all the different points of view and perspectives into the story.
I think one way to think about it, and is that I think these characters, like you mentioned Nancy and Jennifer, who,
Jennifer, sorry, yeah.
yeah, who are not in a way, neither of them is a member of an armed group, neither of them owns land, neither of them works for an American banana company, and so in some ways they're sort of on the outside of that kind of business, right? That sort of trafficking and commerce. However, it's affecting their lives in significant ways. They're right in the middle of it. They are trying, Jennifer's trying to run a bakery with all this going on, and eventually gets a job as an accountant at a banana plantation. And I think what I was interested in was how, in real life, these people don't meet, right? The banana executive in Cincinnati probably never goes to these places, never hangs out with a woman from from a bakery in Curulao, right? But in the book, they're close, right? You go from one
Mm-hmm.
chapter to the next. So you actually do see their lives existing side by side, and you see, the actions that they take affecting the other life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that they do have, and eventually they do meet in the book, right? I mean, I bring them together toward the end of the book, and Jennifer goes to Medellin and goes to the office and meets Jay, um, and so I think I wanted to kind of imagine what each of them sees and how they manipulate that situation. But yeah, I think that's sort of the idea, is to kind of show that people in these sort of distant places are very much connected, and that, that their lives just have all this nuance, right? All this
Mm-hmm.
depth and all these layers to them. And the book is sort of looking at that, looking at these lines between them, at this sort of, I don't know, this sort of web or constellation of lives that are just revolving around each other,
Mm-hmm.
and are are very much connected.
Mm-hmm. So another thing I liked about it, and you sort of capture it in those passages you read, is as the incidents of violence continue to grow in this story, you keep that really understated, and the characters all seem to come to a place where they just recognize that this is part of what's going to be happening from this point forward. Um, so, how did you interview people for this story, or how did you come to a place where you're able to capture the fact that people eventually just kind of figure out that they're going to have to figure out a way to survive, no matter what's going on around them, or no matter how legal it is, or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say interview. I would just say have conversations with people.
Right.
And so, when I first started, I hadn't written a word. I started researching the book. I traveled to see an old friend who I knew when I lived in Bogotá, and he lived in Bogotá. And he grew up in the 80s and 90s in Apartado. He grew up in the middle of all this, and he lived through the transformation from, a culture very much dominated by the guerrillas, or the guerrillas were very much present in everyday life, to the cleansing and then the takeover of the paramilitaries. And so he saw violence, you know, every stage of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to see him. He was in a city, small city named Quibdó on the Pacific coast. And then he sent me with a list of phone numbers and names to Apartado. And he set me up with a taxi driver to pick me up, who also lived through everything. And he had been a banana worker and a banana
Mm.
manager. And, guerrillas tried to kill him one morning and took his
Wow.
house from him and all that. So he became a really interesting source of information. He and I would drive around, and he would tell me stories. And we would sit and have coffee and talk. So that was sort of the first person. And then on that same trip, I went to see another old friend who also grew up in Apartado, and in the middle of everything. Her father was murdered in 1995 by paramilitaries who wanted to use one of his farms for a drug runway. They wanted to put in, which they eventually did. They built a runway and created a way station for trafficking cocaine out of there.
Mm.
And she's one of 22 brothers and sisters who, all lost this one father. And she was like, I think 18, about to, or 17, about to graduate from high school when he was killed.
Mm.
And so through her, listening to her stories and then meeting all of her siblings, I know, I don't know, maybe two-thirds of her siblings by this point. Um, I just heard stories, not just about their father, but everything. They
Mm.
all, a number of her brothers worked in the banana industry. One of her brothers actually did work with a drug cartel and worked with the paramilitaries, not knowing that the paramilitaries were the group that had killed his own father. And so the
Oh.
day he found that out was a rough day, right?
Mm.
And So I would say that, and then just tangentially through these close friends, meeting more people, people
Mm.
who are open to talking. And what I found, working on the book, especially when I was there, is that, people saw me as a safe person to talk to. This is a place that, at least in the 90s and early 21st century, is totally silenced. You couldn't talk at all about any of these things.
Mm.
And so when I roll in the 2016, you wouldn't really hang out and talk about it in a public cafe, because these
Sure.
things are still silent, right? It's still
Yeah.
not safe to name names and say certain things. But people like my friend whose father was murdered, she's kind of fearless. She'll talk about almost anything, and she will name names. And so the most significant part of the research was just sitting down and talking to people,
Mm-hmm.
and having them talk about the 80s and 90s, and yeah, what it was like to be alive and do these things.
Right. Hearing their stories. So I'm sure you must have incorporated a lot of that, what you heard from them, right?
Yeah, in a way, although like your favorite character's completely invented. I never met anyone like her, you know?
Mm,
And so probably in some way all the different pieces of things that I heard and the feeling of talking to women like her,
mm-hmm.
and I did meet women like her because I'm very much I'm closest with the sisters of my close friend. They're just tremendous talkers, and they're very tough women. They're very smart, and they've survived because they're so smart, right? They know
Mm,
how to play their cards, and they know how to navigate, very difficult and violent situations. And so I think she comes out of that. But
mm.
yeah, I never sat down with a woman in a bakery in Curulao to be like, oh, this would be a great character, right? So there's
Right,
not
right.
like a one-to-one thing going on.
Yeah, one of the reasons I liked both Nancy and Jennifer was because they I mean, it just they're constantly under threat of violence. And again, it felt like they're living in this culture that that's just kind of accepted and understood that it's going to be that way. But they both just have such an incredible spirit of survival and figuring out a way to deal with that. Is that still kind of a prevailing attitude in the country, or was that captured more in that time period that you're writing about?
Well, I would say this, that it depends where you live,
Mm,
right? As you said earlier, where there is some sort of economic resource, something that you can trade, something that you can, traffic or export or extract from the earth, there's violence, right? Where
mm,
there's a gold mine, where there's oil, um, even things like bananas, right? I mean, it's still, I would say in a weird way, this very specific region is relatively calm, right? That the banana plantations don't have much violence anymore, although there's some. Um, for example, one of my good friends told me that people steal bananas, right? And they don't steal them to sell them, they steal them because they're hungry.
mm-hmm,
And so every so often, a banana planter will pay the contemporary form of the paramilitaries, which is the drug cartel, to go kill somebody and then post them at the gate of a banana plantation with a stem of bananas. And it's not necessarily somebody who was even stealing bananas, it's just to kind of symbolize what it means to be a banana thief and what the consequences are.
You did a nice job too of capturing how a lot of these people sort of end up in these paramilitary organizations, almost like because they don't have any other choice. Um, how did you get into that mindset?
Well, I think you meet people. Like when I lived in Bogotá, I knew a couple of people who were members of different guerrilla groups,
Mm-hmm.
and they were really nice people. They had, I think, really good intentions in many ways, right? In terms of social justice, in terms of empowering communities that had been
Mm,
exploited and repressed in different ways. But their way of, I think, carrying out that justice or forming solidarity with victims of violence and impoverished people was violent, right? I mean,
mm-hmm.
it was
Right.
going to a hardware store and building a bomb and then bombing a police station. And when you bomb a police station, you kill policemen and maybe you accidentally kill the guy next door, right? Which would happen with frequency. The
Mm-hmm.
guerrillas would try to, kill one person and they would end up, accidentally bombing a daycare or something like that, right? These things happen. And so, anyway, you gradually meet people. And I met people who also were in the paramilitaries, and it's a job, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this is not a job you would take if you were of any privilege, if you were a middle class kid
Right.
who could go to the university or could get any kind of decent, paying job. You were not going to take a job with the paramilitaries or the guerrillas, right? You were going to go become an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor. So that's the recruiting ground. It's people who are, grow up poor, grow up without education and access to education. And often it's the most vulnerable ones. If you go to a community, the one who's the narco in the community in this village in the middle of nowhere, it is kind of the guy who's the bully, right? It's the guy who everybody hates, and he's sort of the outcast in the village. So, you're not cool in your village, so go join these other guys. And then next
Yeah.
thing you know, people have to respect you or at least be afraid of you, right? So you start to understand that it's not about this. I mean, it's nothing, of course, like the movies or the TV makes narcos and paramilitaries. It's just ordinary people.
Right.
It's a job, and violence is not sensational or all that dramatic either. It's also
Right.
just very, just, sad and depressing and
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things you do really brilliantly in this book is capture the normality of how that is so much part of the culture. And I've always thought that it's important for a good novel to love your characters, not be judgmental of their actions. And I think you did a really wonderful job of that. So are you working on a new novel, and is it a Colombia story?
No, I mean, I'm working on two projects. One is a novel that is actually set all over the place. There is, I think, one Colombian character in it, but no, it's a book that begins in Spain, in northern Spain, and then ends up in Mexico. But many of the key characters, or a couple of the key characters in that book, are from Argentina and Chile. And so it's a book that moves around quite a bit through time and space. But it is, yeah, and actually one of those characters also is an Argentinian professor who teaches in Iowa. So there's a little bit of the United States in it also. Yeah, so that's the novel. And then I'm also working on a nonfiction book about just this story of, land being stolen and people trying to get their land restituted in the banana zone in Urabá.
Oh,
And that story is centered on the story of my friend who I was telling you about before, Enilda Jimenez. And so I've spent a lot of time since I finished the novel. I keep going back every year to the same place. And I mostly go just to spend time with her and her family. And we go out to the farm, this very large farm. I mean, it's like 3 square miles of land that was taken from her family when her father was killed, and they've since returned to the land. So this is in like 2018. They went back out there and they've rebuilt the farm and they've turned it into a natural reserve. And so the book is about that. It's sort of telling that story of, the murder of her father, but then and all the consequences of that, but then how they've sort of addressed things today, right? How they're kind of rebuilding their lives in certain ways and getting back to this land.
That sounds
So those are the two projects.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you said you started as a journalist. Do you have any preference as far as nonfiction or fiction, or you'd enjoy both?
I like both a lot, and I especially like I like nonfiction that is, to me, kind of in that gray area between poetry and nonfiction, right? The lyric essayists, and I remember reading, what was it, in like 2014, Claudia Rankine's "Don't Let Me Be Lonely," right? Which has these pictures of TVs with static on them, and then pictures of TVs with images, and then just what she's doing with like the line, right? I mean, shaping text on the page and giving herself sort of the compression. I mean, she considers that a book of poetry, but I read it as a hybrid book. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that those types of nonfiction projects are very interesting to me, that tend to be very compressed, and there's a lot of attention on style and language, and often there's an element of visual, some type of photography or something like that in there.
Cool. So when does the Banana Wars come out in paperback?
I think it comes out in January. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Very soon then.
Yeah,
Cool.
so very soon.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Alan, thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate
thanks
it.
for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks a lot for joining me for this episode of The Song of Roland, a podcast about American culture. I want to thank Alan Grostephan, the author of The Banana Wars, for joining me this episode. I'd also like to thank Stephen Gillis of Dzonk Books for sponsoring this podcast, and I want to thank Tiffany Hauk for her wonderful production skills, and I would like to thank my son Fletcher for his musical contributions. Join me again next time for another episode of The Song of Roland.